Have you ever wondered what is missing in your photograph? If it's either too dark, too bright, too grainy, or whatever it is wrong with your photo, and wondered what am I missing here? And in this video, we are going back to basics again and see the relationship between shutter speeds, aperture, and ISO. That is what's called the exposure triangle, and those are the three elements that makes up a photo. So if you've ever struggled with getting the perfect exposure in your photos, this video is for you. The exposure triangle consists of three key elements: aperture, shutter speeds, and ISO, as we have talked about in previous videos. These three work together to control how light or dark your image is, known as exposure. Think of this as a balancing act. Adjusting one requires you to adjust one of the others to maintain the right exposure in your photos. The first one is aperture. We've talked more in detail about aperture in this video right here. You can watch that after if you want to. But aperture is basically how much light goes in through your lens and hits the sensor. So a lower f-stop number, that means more light comes into your camera sensor. So low f-stop number means more light comes in. High f-stop number means less light come in. This also affects depth of field. So a low aperture number means you have shallower depth of field, which gives you these blurry backgrounds that we like to see in portrait photography. A higher f-stop number means you get more of the scene in focus. That is good for landscape photographers. Next up is shutter speed, and that's basically how long the camera stays open to let light into your sensor. And that is measured in seconds or fractions of seconds, for example, 1 second or 1/500th of a second or 1/250th of a second. And we have talked more in detail about that in this video. And the last one is ISO. That's your camera's sensitivity to light. So a lower ISO number means it's less sensitive, and a higher ISO number means it's more sensitive to light, but that also adds noise or grain to your photos. So you want to know what you're doing if you are adjusting ISO to compensate for either shutter speeds and aperture. Now, let's put it all together and imagine we are out in the night shooting, night street photography again, that's my favorite these days, and you are shooting in this low light environment. That means you have to have a slower shutter speed and wide aperture. That's why I like my Fujifilm 33mm f1.4, because it's so fast, meaning it lets more light into the sensor and I can use faster shutter speeds. But if that's not enough, I need to adjust with a higher ISO. So let's take that into practice and I'll show you how it works. All right, it's one thing to sit in the office talking about these things. The best thing is to be out in the field practicing, and that's exactly what we are going to do now with one guy behind me there singing very bad karaoke, but that's what you get here in Vietnam. But I found a really cool location just outside our hotel that we can use to practice these things. So I have my camera set up now and I've adjusted the ISO all the way up to 8000. That should give me the correct-ish exposure. And what I want to do is take a photo. So that's a very high ISO right there. Will probably give me a very grainy image, but we shall see. See here, it's really not that bad because most cameras these days handles high ISOs, no problems at all. But let's try and adjust the shutter speeds, because I think it would be really cool if we can get some really slow shutter speeds and maybe we can catch some clouds over the hotel there. That would be awesome. So I'm going to set the shutter speed down to, let's say, 1 second. You can see my exposure is way off, so I have to put the ISO all the way down to, let's make it 160, see what happens there. As you can see, this is a pretty cool scene. This here, boys and girls, that's what we want to photograph. 1.3 seconds exposure, and there we go. Yeah, nice, that was pretty cool. Okay, what about aperture? I don't think aperture will do much for us in this image. We just have to remember that this lens is f4.0 at the fastest. So if I want to have the sharpest this lens can do, I'm probably going to dial it up, the aperture up to 10 and 5-second exposure time. That could be interesting. And then we are exactly at 0 according to the light meter of the camera. And the karaoke go has stopped. That's a shame. Okay, image is done. What happens also if you have a higher aperture or a high f-stop number is that you will get these light stars when you have traffic lights or stuff like that. So that's what's going on in the right side of this image. But yeah, you just have to play around yourself like I'm doing now. I'm going to take a few more shots to see what happens. There wasn't as much clouds in the sky as I hoped for, but there you go. You just have to practice and see what works for yourself. That's the whole point of being out doing photography. I got some other shots way back at the parking lot there, reflections of this same thing, so I'm going to maybe try to do that tomorrow if we have the same conditions. Alrighty then, back to the office. And that's short and sweet with an example about the exposure triangle. Now I have an exercise for you that you can go and try out today after watching this, hopefully. Okay, so we are going to go and try these light trails again that we did in the other video. You need your camera that you can set to manual for this. You need a tripod or a stable surface so you can play around with the settings, making sure that everything is directed at the scene you have chosen. And then you just start to play around with the exposure triangle. A useful thing that you can also use for this is your camera's light metering. That means when it's at 0, you have a good exposure and everything is in balance according to what your camera sees. So then you start adjusting the ISO, the shutter speeds and the aperture respectively and see how this works. Like, are you underexposing, meaning the light meter goes to minus, or are you overexposing? And then you take a bunch of photos and then you can compare. Try a very slow shutter speeds and high aperture, meaning that you get more of the scene in sharp focus. If you are in traffic, for example, you get more of these light trails with very slow shutter speeds, and you can also keep the ISO lower to have a cleaner image. You can always add grain in post if you want to be a little bit creative with your edits, but try to keep the ISO as low as possible for the cleanest image. Obviously, if you are doing a lot of night street photography or want to do night street photography, that's a bit more tricky. Then you have to compensate with faster shutter speeds and higher ISOs to get the same result. That also adds a bit of grain. But to me, I don't think that's a problem, because with AI denoise technology in our softwares today, we can always get rid of that noise we don't like if we want to get rid of it, or we can keep it for a creative look on our photos. And that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, you can leave a thumbs up. That would be awesome. And if you want to subscribe to the channel, you can also subscribe to my channel. That helps me make more and better content for you. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.